Hello and welcome to our presentation. Specific learning difference, difficulty or disability arose by any other name, which is a critical disability studies approach. And this presentation is by Victoria Mann and Holly Burkinshaw. Holly's not available to present today, but she has done a lot of work around creating the slides and doing a lot of the research, and I'm going to present on behalf of both of us. So just before I start, and I will say again before this slide does come up, parts of this workshop discuss words used to describe disability, and they might be triggering and might be quite upsetting. And also some things that come up within the session might be triggering also. Again, if anything that's coming up that might be triggering, we'll let people know, and I will warn before we come up. So introduction. So this presentation will discuss the discourse around SPLDs, and we're going to do that using a critical disability theory approach. So in order to do that, we'll briefly explain critical disability studies, back a whistle-stop tour. We will consider the current discourse around SPLD. We will discuss the impact of discourse, and we'll make a case for the D in SPLD to be a disability. Again, this is based on critical disability studies. Other people from different perspectives will be able to make a case for different words to be used for the D. So this isn't like that we're saying this is the only way. We're just saying this is what critical disability studies says about discourse. So firstly, what is critical disability studies? Well, it considers how institutions, cities or societies disable people. And so in terms of almost like the social model of people being disabled by society, but it also looks at how the body and impairment can be incorporated into these discussions around disability and disablement, because often it can feel that people have been disembodied. So we're looking at the kind of the bodily impairment and kind of how that intersects with to create a disability. So disability studies, therefore, considers disability to be both a political and social kind of definition on power relations, but also a lived reality in which the experience of people with the disabilities are central to interpreting their place in the world. So the key parts of critical disability study is the way it challenges ableism. So broadly speaking, it would contest that people are all temporarily able-bodied. So whereas often to be able-bodied is considered the norm, and disabled is kind of something less than the norm. So we have the norm, then we have disabled. Critical disability studies would say that we are only ever temporarily able-bodied, and actually, as we said in the next point, the norm is to be disabled. Some level of to be disabled is part of the norm. You might be able-bodied now, but that is likely to be a temporary state. So, for example, in 2012, I broke my ankle and couldn't walk for 7 weeks. So again, I experienced disability and ability, and that's kind of how people's experiences are. So thus impairment is actually part of the normal human condition. That is kind of an integral part, and that is ableism is the idea that it is normal to be able-bodied and everything else is something different. So it considers impairment as part of that human condition. Further, disabled people have more than one story, and we have to be aware of kind of the way disabled people are represented in the media in terms of this one story. We will look at this in more detail further on. So thus, this disability is not a category of exceptionality. Disability is part of the human condition, and to be aware of this about how diagnoses can be labelling and how we can be aware of these labelling and the issues around this. So in terms of disability studies, it would consider a disabled person as a person with an impairment who experiences disability. So the disability is the interactions between the person with the impairment and their environment. So the impairment is part of the negative reaction, but not the cause of it, nor does it justify disability. Say, for example, I have elements of dyscalculia, and most of the time that's fine, but occasionally, for example, if I'm booking plane tickets, I might put them on the wrong date, and because plane companies don't really won't change the time, then that turns into something difficult. Like, for example, I was going to Transylvania in Romania a few years ago, and I accidentally booked the plane ticket 2 days later than I should have done, and ended up having to book a hotel because it was cheaper to book a hotel for 2 more nights in Romania than it was to try and move my flight. So that's kind of the intersection. So Impairment is your illness, injury or condition that causes or is likely to cause a difference of physiological or psychological function. And disability is the loss or limitation of opportunities to take part in society on an equal level with others due to these societal environmental barriers. And this comes from Leeds University's definition. So the critical disability studies model of disability could be seen as almost like a modified version of the social model based on 3 principles. It sees disability in itself as a social construct and not an inevitable consequence of impairment. So the disability is an interrelationship between the impairment, the person's response to that impairment, and to their environment. And the social disadvantage is caused by the physical, institutional, attitudinal environment that fails to meet the needs of people who do not exceed what we think of as normalcy. It's described by the World Health Organization as a biopsychosocial model. So this is just a reflection point, and you can pause the video for a few minutes and just think about kind of do you think this compares to the social and medical model of disability? And if you do work in the field of SBLDs or disability, how do you feel that this reflects your experience of SBLDs? So key differences between the biosocial model and the social model. Well, it includes the embodied experience of illness impairment, which often the social model doesn't seem to be there. It also considers intersectionality, and it takes the view that public policy must respond to both the biomedical and the social aspects of disability. So the next slide coming up is slide 10, and this is the one which you may find triggering. So if you want to kind of skip ahead to the slide, we can put a marker on that. I'll put a marker at the bottom, and then you can kind of skip ahead to the next slide. So let's consider discourse around disability. This is so important because discourse shapes how we understand the world and kind of our framework. As I've said, this idea of to be able-bodied is a norm through that discourse that has shaped this. And disability discourse has evolved, and some of the words you'll hear now are ones that actually are quite triggering. For example, crippled, that used to be the crippled society. Handicapped, and in fact, I think in America you may still hear handicapped is one that you will hear. And again, handicapped is situating the disability in the individual. And then finally, disabled. And in terms of learning disabilities, there was imbecile. My great granddad, he was, when I looked at this, I was looking at our census, and his job in 1902 was put down as an imbecile attendant, and that was his job. And I think the discourse is very powerful there, imbecile and attendant. So not a support worker, not somebody to attend to that person. So this kind of idea of you are just there to take care of them, very infantilizing, turning people like children. The idea of disability is being a childlike state. And then again, retarded, this idea of in some way having some sort of arrested development. And then we've moved now on to learning disabled in terms of like general learning difficulties, disabilities. So why is discourse important? Well, as I've alluded to, the way we choose to speak about disability matters because it's the way in which we view the world, and it's the way in which we control the world. I'm sure we all remember Donald Trump mocking the disabled journalists and the kind of the way he used that as a way of shutting down that person and kind of marginalising them. And disabled people have been undervalued and underrepresented in history, and particularly during the Industrial Revolution, where people were often considered in their contribution to the economy. They were often seen as being a productive or an unproductive body. And I think we can see that now. If you look at our universities, the big push towards vocational things, it's what will you contribute to the economy? How will you produce? And therefore, disabled people are seen to be less productive and therefore less valued. So systematically undervalued and unrepresented. And this has formed the stigmas, assumptions and prejudice we have to this day. So we as educators need to kind of recognise this and look at the powers at play in discourse and what's kind of happening. So the next slide is going to look at some things in the newspaper, which again you may find triggering, but just to be aware. The idea of disability as a personal tragedy, or disability as somehow creating exceptional, like the idea of special needs. You're somehow special, you're somehow different, you're therefore othered. So discourse around the prevention and cure have been highly problematic for both equality and the social rights of disabled people, and therefore can act to disempower people with SBLDs. So on reflection, I've mentioned a few of the discourse of disability that I could think of. Maybe you could reflect on discourse that you often encountered, perhaps during the news, and how does this frame and shape people's understanding of disability? So again, if you'd like to pause the session just for a few minutes to reflect upon this. Okay, so here's an example of, and this came from 2020. So guess where this came from and when. This actually was an Ed Psych report from 2020, which uses the phrase suffering with dyslexia. So even though we think we may have left this discourse in the past, we do still see it, this idea of you are suffering from, you're afflicted with. So it's you're the one with the problem, you're suffering from this. And I don't know if you're familiar with Rod Nicholson, but he's done a lot of work on the kind of positive psychology and some of the and how dyslexia can often kind of be quite beneficial. For example, architecture. It can often we often have a lot of students who are in architecture, and they seem to be able. And I'm not necessarily linking this dyslexia, but they seem to be able to turn a 2D image into a 3D visualization and kind of turn it around and look at it from the top. So this idea of suffering, where it does have a lot of negative and stigmatizing connotations. So here are some examples of discourse in the news. A blind 21-year-old who overcame numerous disabilities. Katie Price is a hero to the parents of disabled kids. 15% of the world suffer from a disability. And this one, which is from the Metro this year, don't think disabled people have it easy because we get perks. This idea that disabled people are somehow getting benefits others can't and are somehow getting an easy ride. So the discourse is, you've overcome it, you're a hero, or you're suffering. So you're suffering, or you're a hero, or you're in some way swinging the lead. There's a lot of discourse that is really shaping how people view disability. And the discourse it could be not necessarily verbal. It could be in terms of associations. This is obviously this is shorthand for a loo. So you see that, you know, that's an accessible toilet. But what does it tell us? It tells people that a disability is physical, that it's static, that disability issues can be addressed just with improving accessibility, and then we're done. And it fails to represent other disabilities, for example, fluctuating disabilities. So somebody with a colostomy bag or something like that, for example, who may be fine sometimes, but other times may not. Or, for example, someone with ME who might use the accessible toilet sometimes, but others. It doesn't reflect their experience. And I understand it's a shorthand for this is this is a service for people, this is an accessible toilet, but nevertheless, it is perpetuating these discourse associations. And here's a discussion point for you maybe to think about when you go back to your colleagues, or maybe to reflect upon now, is the discourse around these two images. So again, when we see the bear, we think of, oh, poor children in need, we need to kind of give to children. So again, very disempowering, very stigmatized. And again, this one here of the associations, we must break free of our EU and take control of our behaviour. But if you look at the people, they're all BAME people, young men. I can't see any women or children there. Creating a very stigmatised kind of association through this poster. So discourse can be a means to disempower. And as for COSAs, unless we can see through these things, we only see them through that lens. So unless we see past the socially accepted common sense knowledge, then we cannot see other than surface level meanings. So our understanding of learners with SBLDs is formed through this lens, and we do not challenge these knowledges and our constructed notions of what is the norm. So by such, the personal therefore is political. And by calling someone different or suggesting they have difficulties controls the way someone's thought about. The difference or difficulty is therefore individual to the learner and exists within the learner. So disability has had a long history of fighting what is considered to be equal in society, and by using the term disability, it gives it a political term that highlights the structural inequalities that place obstacles in the way of learners, as opposed to it being situated. So disability, therefore, suggests that society and institutions need to change to accommodate the individual rather than the individual being expected to adapt. A lot of these slides were created by my colleague Holly, who is a PhD student and also has SBLDs. And this is something that she feels very strongly about this need to recognise the structural inequalities around disability. So current discourse around dyslexia. So disability, as we've said, this is a political term, and it suggests that society and social norms and regulations act in a way to cause problems to some learners. Difficulty, again, suggests an individual struggle. The struggle is with the individual. You are having difficulties. And difference is one that we feel quite positive about, but not yet, because of the structural inequalities that we currently face. So So it suggests that only SBLD students are different at the moment, where of course all students have differences, but equally it can make issues around students thinking, if I have a difference, does that mean I'm not got a disability? And if I've not got a disability, should I be claiming disability allowance? Should I be getting the adjustments because it's a difference, it's not a difficulty? And so again, it's kind of I think we're hoping in the future, as we move forward in society, the structural inequalities go, that it will turn into a difference. In the same way that I'm left-handed, I'm waving my hand, I'm left-handed. That's it's just a difference. It's a variant. It's not a disability, because society, well, apart from when I'm trying to open a tin, it's not a disability in the same way. So we're hoping we can move towards difference. So just to underline that fact, everybody has differences, but some differences have the negative consequences, and this is the negative consequences. For example, 30% of people in prison have dyslexia. In some prisons, such as in Texas, that rises to 50%. Dyslexic students, even well-compensated ones, achieve lower results than their non-dyslexic peers for SAT, CAT, GCSE examinations, and the disparity in the groups increases. According to the BBC, 52% of dyslexic people reported having experienced discrimination during interview or selection processes, which again links into this idea of productive bodies. Often when students ask me whether they should disclose their SBLD, the first question I will say is, does the job have a disability positive sticker? And if they say yes, I think absolutely. If they say, well, no, they don't, it's a very difficult one, and I give the students the information and leave them to make their own judgment. But often students feel that they have experienced discrimination during selection processes. I'm just going to take a quick drink, if that's okay. So equally, this idea of disability, if we're calling it a difference, we need to be kind of aware of the impact that has on students. So we need to be aware that the social and medical model tends to be based around physical disabilities, which are largely unchanging. So issues like epilepsy, as I've said, ME, and SBLDs, which can affect people on different days, can therefore be forgotten. So SBLDs aren't based on physical barriers. This can be seen as a hierarchy in disability, both among disability groups and society, because there's a perception of what this disability looks like and what does not look like. Thus, the person with the hidden disability, the SBLD student, may feel that they cannot assume the label of disability, and it's being reinforced by the use of difference. Equally, the person with the hidden disability, they can assume different identities, and therefore they're forced to make daily decisions about which identity to embody, in the awareness that they have to negotiate whether to disclose a disability or give the society the impression of being able-bodied. So thus, they're constantly having to decide how to embody this. Indeed, Susan Wendell did some research on this in terms of illness rather than disability, and she discusses disability to what she calls pass as non-disabled, and she recognises that an ability to pass allows people to avoid the discrimination and prejudice, but creates a paradigm where the person feels being accused of seeking special treatment, and that their disability is not a real one. Again, back to Valerius, she did research with young people with a hidden disability, and they felt that they didn't fit into the label of disabled, that they were in the middle. Sometimes they felt disabled and sometimes not. And the implications of this minimisation and lack of a disabled identity is students may feel they aren't entitled to additional support, and thus they may internalise the difficulties they're having on their course. An example of this is Dale and Aiken found in their research that dyslexic nurses often try and conceal their difficulties because they see it as a problem within them. So just a quick reflection, if you just want to pause the video again, have any of your students experienced or discussed any of these terms about kind of whether they've had any negative feedback from their colleagues that they're not really disabled or issues on their course? Or sometimes the lecturers may think that the student should be cured by now and it should have been fixed. So why is the term disability so important? It acknowledges the embodied experience of the student. It doesn't erase the student's experience of being disabled by society. It acknowledges the structural inequalities. It provides legal protection, because the Equality Act, the term disability is registered as a special protection under the Equality Act, and it recognises to some extent forced intimacy. In order for students with SPLD to get support, they have to tell very personal details to a variety of people. So first of all, they think they might have a disability. So they then have to go to a disability advisor and tell the disability advisor everything. Then they have to go for an assessment and they have to tell the story to their assessor. Then they have to go to a needs advisor and tell their story to them. And then they come to the SPLD tutor and they're having to tell the story again. And it could be stories about their past, their difficulties at school, very kind of personal things. And they're doing this in order to access the service to which they're entitled. So they're entitled to this support, but in order to gain access to it, they're having to share very, very personal things. And the term disability recognises this this forced intimacy. Equally, it fights stigma, but we can then say to academics, etc., this is a disability, this is disabling our students, and therefore it addresses the delegitimisation of SPLDs. So in terms of the embodied experience, for our students, this again was written by a student with SPLDs, and she said the embarrassment felt by SPLD learners when they can't keep up in lectures, or they take longer to write assignments, or they have spelling mistakes that people see. This is especially online, where students are being asked to type in the chat box and may make spelling mistakes, how awkward that can be. The accusation of not meeting socially constructed developmental learning goals, who sets these goals, like spelling goals, things like this. If you've got dyscalculia, like I have, the idea of why can't you do your timetable, you're 47 in my case, this idea of you're not meeting the goals, the notion of being somehow different and having to constantly explain your needs and hoping that you're going to be understood and catered for. So if you have an SPLD, you're having to get meetings, you're having to talk to exams to make sure your exams are spread out. This takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. So there's an extra cognitive load and workload on students with an SPLD that we just don't recognise. For example, my students have to email me, I send them a few times, they have to pick a time, then we come back to them with a meeting, all time that they could be spent in working. Or like I said, with exams, they might need to make sure their adjustments are in place. So they might need to email somebody and check. All extra cognitive load and all extra workload that isn't actually acknowledged within that embodied experience. So in terms of the medicalisation of SPLD tutors, although we talk about the social model, there is a lot of medicalisation, not necessarily of the SPLD tutorials, but of the getting to the tutorials. So first of all, you have to do the diagnostics. You have to prove that you have an SPLD. So you have to go for an assessment. You have to they take a case history at the assessment, and you have to prove that you are disabled enough. Make sure you have the SPLD is enough, and then you are granted the SPLD tutorial, which is really a gatekeeping of resources. It's they have to make sure you're disabled enough. And disabled activists have long acknowledged the role and power of the medical profession in the lives of disabled people. And the notion that learning or types of learning can be medicalised, categorised or diagnosed propels the profession into greater powers at the expense of disabled learning. They're relying on those professionals in order to get that diagnostic that will allow them to access reasonable adjustments, the SPLD tutorials, and all the other and the learning plans that universities offer. So just a quick reflection again, just for a few minutes. So which model do you use in your practice, and how do you use discourse to empower your students? Okay, so as we talked about structural inequalities, here's just a few examples of some of the things that can be for a student. So the assumption that students can fill in a form and be able to kind of do, for example, to get an extension, to access the course. The assumption everyone can tell the time, get to class on time. The assumption that a test or essay is an objective or fair way to grade someone's ability in an area. The assumption that offering support to a student with SPLDs makes them equal in learning with no understanding of the extra time and emotional labour accessing support takes, which, as we've talked about, this cognitive and workload. And the assumption that extending deadlines or offering more time and exams will equalise an assessment. So these are just some of the structural inequalities around SPLDs in learning. So as I've said, legal protection, by having SPLD in disability, then this is set out in the Equality Act, the protection. The issue, obviously nothing's perfect, and the issues with this is the reasonable adjustments are still situated in the individual. These are your adjustments, as opposed to a framework of, these are the adjustments that make something more accessible. It's like, no, this is what you particularly need. There's always going to be that to a certain extent, but what we would like to see is a move towards a more inclusive classroom where there will still need to be individual adjustments for the student, but to which the classroom itself is more inclusive, because again, situates disability individual, and it creates extra load for the student as they're having to try and get their adjustments. For example, the student that keeps having to email their lecturer to get their slides in advance, because that's on their learning plan, whereas if that was the university's policy, all slides in advance, that would get rid of that load for the student. So as I've said about forced intimacy, here's that's a list of everybody that I've said. And here's a quote from a student from my PhD, which I'm just going to read in full because I think it's quite powerful. So you have to give all your history and family history, then it's off to an assessment centre, requiring again that you tell your personal details to another stranger. If you have dyslexia, you have to have an assessment of needs. That's another stranger to hear all about you. Finally, you're given a tutor, and guess what? You have to tell them about all your history and struggles. Susie, student participants. So you can imagine, having to tell all of these different people these very personal and possibly painful details. Stigma. This slide on stigma, I have used an article from student doctors in their F1, which is their foundation year, and it talked about some of the stigma that they felt, for example, stonewalling. And this, for example, one student said, I wrote to the lecturers and complained about a scenario in the OSCE, and they said tough luck. Responses. Medical students may act negatively when you tell them, and I often felt like people thought I was stupid. I remember someone saying, oh, just have cod liver oil tablets. So they obviously don't believe it's a real thing, and it's quite upsetting. I've even had people say, who cares if you're dyslexic? I don't think you should get special provision. Disclosure, issues around disclosure. One F1 student who just left university said, I can't turn around and say, I'm dyslexic, this is how I do it, let me get on with it, because one, it's rude, and two, I don't want people on the wards to know I'm dyslexic. Influence on career pathway. Students said they were reluctant to apply for a competitive speciality. And then this idea of working at life in the real world. I think after medical school, the support's gone. That's it, you're in the real world. You won't get extra time examining patients, and you don't get the same empathy, sympathy or understanding. I'm very, very sorry for dyslexics who don't have as good coping mechanisms as me. And that's from 2017. And this, like I said, it was F1 doctors who just left medical school and were just going into their first year. So legitimisation of SPLDs. So by recognising the disabling impact of the SPLDs, we can counter voices who argue against it. So we do still sometimes get lecturers saying, oh, it's just a middle class term for people who can't do the work. We do see that quite a lot. And terming it as a disability keeps it political to ensure it's part of the discussion. For example, in inclusion discussions, we need to keep SPLD central to that discussion, in that discussion. It reassures students in terms of access to help and fairness, etc. It begins to address the stigma, and it recognises the influence of the medical model in the world of SPLDs, which, as I've said with the diagnostic, is still a thing. So, as I've said again, in an ideal world, every student would be able to get the individual and tailored support they would want, and the classroom would be inclusive. We're unlikely to ever be able to achieve that, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't strive for better inclusion for all students. And only when attitudes to disability change can this become possible. So one way to do this is to empower disabled students by using discourse that doesn't eliminate their personal struggles or depoliticise their experience of oppression, stigma and prejudice. So we state that by using disability, that keeps it in the political arena and recognises the structural and embodied lived experience of our students. So reflection, as I've said, this is something from one perspective, from the critical disabilities perspective. So maybe you could reflect on which D, difference, difficulty, disability you prefer and why that is and how that works for you. So in conclusion, as I've said, it's not that it's bad to call it a difference. It acknowledges every difference, and I'm hoping we're taking steps to get to the point where it is a difference. We're arguing that society isn't quite ready yet to accept differences and act accordingly. So right now, we need the word political term disability to keep the fires burning. Otherwise, we would risk disempowering SPLD students and depoliticising SPLDs. And thank you so much for listening. I know that's quite heavy. And this is the references. And if anybody is interested in contacting me and talk about this some more, I'd love to hear everybody's opinion. And as I've said, I really appreciate everybody taking part in this online seminar. Thank you very much.